Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first humanities lecture for the semester. As you can see from the syllabus, I'll be doing quite a few of these lectures. Based on some emails that I've been receiving, I just want to remind everybody to follow the syllabus, which is under files and Canvas. Don't try and follow the course by just following the assignments. The assignments basically will appear when things are due, when you have work to turn in, but they won't include, the readings that we're going to be doing and how much of each chapter to read and when. You need to follow the syllabus for that. And I will be publishing the assignments for the most part a few days before each of them are due. And if you do have any questions about what's coming up, you can always email me and I'll let you know, but just for a reminder. I'm going to be basically working from a biography of John Locke, our main figure here for the beginning of the semester. You can find actually a copy of the biography I'm going to be using as my basic framework under files in the Locke folder in Canvas if you want to check that out. But I'll be adding a lot to it. I'll just be using that to just kind of organize my discussion a little bit. So we'll start off with John Locke, and then we'll move on next to Voltaire. The two are very similar. Their names often appear in some similar places because they were both Enlightenment thinkers, and we'll talk about what that means. But we're starting off with John Locke's second treatise on government. Make sure your book likely came with a copy of the first and the second treatise. Make sure you're reading the second treatise and not the first treatise. The second treatise is really the one that's most important, certainly for our purposes. And just to give you a quick picture here, this is what John Locke looks like. This is the most famous picture. It's the one you'll find most frequently on the internet or in books, and when people refer to John Locke. And he's surrounded there with all of his books behind him. So that's basically what John Locke looked like. Again, the person we're discussing. John Locke was an empiricist thinker. And as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Because there was a group of empiricists who are from Britain. So people generally refer to them as the British empiricists. There was a group of thinkers who were kind of coming from a different perspective called the continental rationalist thinkers. And they're both groups are important. They did share some ideas and beliefs, but their general way of looking at human experience, how human beings acquire knowledge, where meaning comes from, what we should look to as a means of acquiring knowledge, right? Because it could come from various sources potentially. Truth. What is truth consist in? How do we find the truth? A major split between these British empiricists and continental rationalists. Here is basically a picture of the continental rationalists here over on the right-hand side. So we have Locke, Berkeley, and Hume are the basic continental British empiricists people refer to, and Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz are the continental rationalists. So British empiricist means the British Isles, right? So England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. Continental rationalist refers to continental Europe. And mostly that refers to Spain to a certain extent, definitely Germany, definitely France, Italy to a certain extent, but that's what continental refers to here, continental Europe. And the main differences between them were that the British empiricists looked towards human experience as a source of knowledge and meaning and truth, etc. Right? That's what empiricism means. When you hear that word empiricism or see that word empiricism, it refers to human experience. right? And human experience being the source of knowledge and meaning for human beings. They're tied obviously very closely to science, right? The empirical method, as we think of the scientific method. Um, on the other side, we have these continental rationalists, Descartes being the most famous. They really distrusted human experience and pointed out the fact that our senses can deceive us, right? We think we can see something, and let's say you think you see a really small tree, but it happens to be a big tree and you're just really far away from it. Or you're confused about something you dreamt about, um, versus something that you actually experienced. Um, all kinds of ways in which our senses can deceive us. So the continental rationalists tended to focus more on ideas, right? Whereas the empiricists looked outward, using their senses to try and understand the environment, with science as kind of a model. The rationalists looked inward and said, what can I know? What can I understand by just sort of looking at the ideas in my head, essentially? So the empiricists are looking outside, continental rationalists are turning inward. Descartes' discourse on method was basically these exercises that Descartes undertook, where he basically sat in a dark room with a candle, kind of staring at the candle and thinking about the ideas that were going through his head, right? Descartes famous in these meditations, as he called them, for the idea, I think, therefore I am. That was Descartes' initial effort to try and build his sense of meaning and knowledge and truth, and a source of what he could know about, not by looking outwards, but by looking inwards, right? So he's kind of doing these meditations. And the first thing he says, I can know for certain, because both of these groups are really trying to acquire certain knowledge, right? Something that's really a strong foundation. And Descartes said, the one thing I can know for sure is that I exist, because I'm sitting here thinking, right? Sitting before this candle, and I must be a thinking being. So he started with, I think, therefore I am. And he built his knowledge of the world out from that as his fundamental principle. Whereas, again, the empiricists are using their senses, looking outside them to try and build their knowledge of the empirical world. These thinkers are typically both identified with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment being a period, basically 17th century and 18th century, mostly in Europe, of trying to develop a new way of trying to, again, acquire knowledge and truth, a new form of authority for what we can know that could be used to build governments, it can be used to build an economy, to understand human nature, right? All these kinds of things. And instead of using the authority of tradition or the church, right? The idea is to use our own human mind, our own human abilities, right? And again, the empiricists would do that in a slightly different way than the rationalists would do it. But they're all, basically trying to acquire a new modes of understanding, new ways of learning about themselves and about the world that do not rely on just the authority of tradition, right? Which obviously can be wrong, it can be outdated, or the church. So there was a time when there was this emphasis on the separation of church and state, right? And this is where in particular, the British empiricists would be influential on our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, on political philosophy in this country. And we'll look at that a little bit later when we'll compare Locke and Thomas Jefferson, because Locke was a great influence on Thomas Jefferson. But these are all what you might call Enlightenment thinkers. Ultimately, the British empiricists become more important, become kind of the dominant approach to having a foundation for knowledge and meaning and truth. Though there would remain thinkers that would follow along with the more kind of rationalist perspective, which you can identify more with what's often called the idealist, right? The world of ideas, where the empiricists were interested in empirical reality, physical reality, nature as we experience it. The rationalists were focused more turning inward on the world of ideas. Um, there were precedents for both forms of thinking that go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Any of you who have studied Plato and Aristotle might be aware that Aristotle was very much sort of a forefather of the empirical tradition. He was almost a scientist in a way, studying the natural world, plant and animal life. Alexander the Great was one of his students. When Alexander the Great was out on his conquest of Europe, he would send back samples of plant and animal life to Aristotle that Aristotle could study. Aristotle developed the first kind of way of organizing plant and animal life. It's not totally unlike the way in which we understand, genus and species, et cetera, today. Aristotle's teacher, however, if we go back a little further, was Plato. Plato was an idealist. Plato believed more in the realm of ideas, the world of ideas. There's a very famous painting called The School of Athens. And in the center of that painting, it's all the famous Greek philosophers, mathematicians, etc. And in the center of that painting is a picture, is a pair of people, and it's Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle's pointing down at the ground. Let's stay grounded on the natural physical reality that we can experience through our senses, right? Empirical reality. And Plato is pointing up in the air to the realm of ideas and saying, no, we should put our focus into the realm of ideas. That's the only place perfection can exist, right? Perfection can't exist in the everyday physical world. Everything is imperfect, right? The only perfect circle exists in the world of ideas, not in physical reality. So interestingly, the source of this kind of separation that you can see a version of with the empiricist versus the rationalist goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. And some people will still argue that everybody ultimately is either an Aristotelian or a Platonist, because all schools of philosophy have kind of branched out from a more Aristotelian perspective or a more Platonic idealist perspective. So I just wanted you to see the group of people that were around at the same general time that Locke was. Some who shared his basic approach, that would be Berkeley and Hume, versus those who didn't, and those would be Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. So those are the main figures at the time, the main thinkers at the time that you'll see referred to. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about Locke's biography, his background, and then we'll get into his key sort of ideas. And I do believe I have a slide that shows a little bit of, or I did, a slide that has a little bit of the background of Locke. Let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, it's not wanting to work for me right now. Okay, give me a second to try to set this up again and see if I can get it to work, because I really want to show these slides to you. So just give me a second here. So we have Locke's biography. See if I can get that to share. So just a real basic biography of Locke and Locke's ideas. So you can see he lived between 1632 and 1704. He's viewed as a Republican, not Republican in the sense of we think of Republicans as a political party today. Republicanism referred to a form of government where you vote for your leaders, right? People that represent you. It's kind of an indirect form of democracy, and that's actually what we have in this country. For the most part, is indirect form of democracy, right? Even for the presidential elections, we have electors, as we know from this past election. So we had people that represent us. We don't have direct democracy. That's really difficult to do when you have, a large population, a large a large nation. It has been done before. For a time, Athens and Greece had a direct democracy where all the people directly voted for decisions that were made about new laws and policies, fighting wars, right? All those kinds of things. Identified with Republican thought is the social contract theory, and we will talk about that a little bit. That's one of the important developments of this time. We still utilize what's basically a social contract form of arrangements in terms of understanding the relationship between people and their government that we have in this country. Reason and experience is a foundation for truth, as I mentioned earlier. So when you see experience, think of empiricism. Again, the two treatises on government, maybe his most famous work, though he did write lots of other things. He was a Puritan by his background, which is very interesting because Puritans obviously are very conservative. His family, his parents would have followed the church, the dictates of the church. So he would have grown up being very socially, culturally, and politically conservative. But he would turn into somebody who was, for the time being, I mean, for the time that he was living in, relatively radical as one of these, Enlightenment thinkers, turning away from the authority of the church and of religion and of tradition. And when I say tradition, one of the things that follows with that is the aristocracy and the monarchy, right? Though those are often associated with the church to the extent that rulers, kings want to believe they ruled by divine right. That was a way of saying that they were kind of one with the church and they were speaking with the authority of God because they were chosen by God to be, leaders. We typically call those people autocrats because they typically believe that they control the church and not just political arrangements. As we get to later monarchies, and we'll talk about that a little bit, those monarchies are often separated off from the church and sometimes in conflict with the church, right? This happened very famously with Henry VIII, when Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church. And the Church of England, which was more of a Protestant kind of religion, was developed. And so what Henry VIII was actually trying to do there was take back control of things related to the church, because he would be the head and was the head of the Church of England. Whereas previously, when the Catholic Church was predominant, he had to share power essentially with the Pope, right? So there are all these different kinds of political arrangements we'll talk about. But it's interesting that Locke became relatively radical growing up a Puritan. He did get a medical degree from Oxford. That's important. Again, Locke was an empiricist, right? And that empiricism influenced medicine as well, right? People started wanting to study human beings and the way human beings work and looking at cadavers, right? Taking them apart, trying to understand them, became very popular, both to understand how human beings work and also to try and heal them. Locke actually did perform surgery at one point in time, which was very dangerous at the time because of the concerns that people had about infection. And still today, that's a major risk when we do surgeries. But they would dissect these cadavers and take bodies apart, et cetera. So Locke was really an empiricist, and that was his own sort of grounding in empiricism is in terms of his direct practice of empiricism was in part through medicine. Other empiricists did other kinds of things and studied, other aspects of nature. He was a personal physician to Earl of Shaftesbury. The Earl of Shaftesbury was the person that he actually did surgery on, and the Earl of Shaftesbury actually ended up surviving the surgery, which got him on. Locke became somebody who had the support then of the Earl of Shaftesbury, which would have been valuable for him, right, to have support of somebody who was a part of the aristocracy, even though Locke ultimately was trying to move away from the authority of tradition in terms of aristocracy, the monarchy, etc. We won't really get into this Rye House plot a lot, but there was all kinds of political intrigue going on at the time. What was called the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was something that really influenced a lot, and what was going on in England in particular. It was basically the overthrow of King James II of England through a union of English parliamentarians and William of Orange, who was actually Dutch. And it was sort of one of the political changes that is sort of, and among the changes that kind of haltingly, kind of one step forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, eventually got England on the path to a regular sort of constitution, right? And ultimately moving away from the monarchy. Obviously, England still has a king today and a queen, or at this current time, just a queen, but the queen is basically a figurehead, right? The queen is not making laws and policies and debates and that sort of thing. There's a parliament that does that. But this Glorious Revolution of 1688 was sort of a step along the way to that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple other issues related to Locke's education, and then we'll get on more to his specific kind of theories that he adopted. He was relatively well educated. He was sent to a prestigious school called the Westminster School in London. His family wasn't super wealthy, so he was sponsored by a guy named Alexander Popham, who was a member of Parliament. And then he went on after that to study at Oxford, or what was called Christ Church, Oxford at the same time. Basically, all early universities were associated with the church in one way or another. So that's why it was known at the time as Christ Church at Oxford. Today, we basically just call it Oxford. He studied philosophy quite a bit, including Descartes. So he did study, rationalism, even though he would become an empiricist himself. And sort of found modern philosophy a little more interesting than the classical philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, etc. Though he was definitely influenced by those people as well. He was wanting to see, what's coming down the road, what's new, pushing the boundaries, right? Forging ahead with new ideas and new forms of thinking and new forms of problem solving. And not just, again, following classical philosophy and its ways of doing things. And again, ultimately studied medicine, received a bachelor's degree in 1656, a master's degree, in 1658, Bachelor of Medicine in 1674. And during his time at Oxford, he got to study with all kinds of famous people, including Robert Boyle of Boyle's Law. You might all have already heard of before, was another scientist. So it was an exciting time when he was young and when he was studying, because there were all these new ideas floating around, people pushing boundaries, etc. And again, moving away from the authority of tradition and the church. Locke also was a secretary of the Board of Trade and Plantations, and also secretary to the Lords and Proprietors of the Carolinas. So he was involved in international trade and economics. And obviously the Carolinas would have been sort of the main place in which a lot of that would have taken place, because that's where cotton was coming from, that's where rice was coming from, right? Wool originally, tobacco, other kinds of things that were big, exports to England for cigars and pipes in terms of tobacco, with these huge tobacco plantations that we had in the southern colonies, for the textile industry. But most of the cotton and wool was sent either to England or actually to New England in this country, where the textile mills existed. So he was heavily involved in that. We know that depended on slave labor. As you may have noticed in reading the first part of Locke, and as I'll talk about a little more here down the road, Locke actually created an argument against slavery. He saw slavery as actually a state of war between people. Certainly the kind of slavery we had in this country. But so he's being a little bit inconsistent here, much as the person he influenced greatly, Thomas Jefferson, in being philosophically against slavery, but actually being implicated in slavery at the same time for quote unquote practical concerns, right? Jefferson, as we'll talk about, in his private correspondence, saw slavery as a great evil. He did have some language condemning slavery in an early draft of the Declaration of Independence. It was debated on and removed in the Declaration of Independence. He knew it would have to come at some point. And I think Locke probably himself recognized that that was the case. As we move into the Civil War era in this country, right, when emancipation took place, at least the initial emancipation took place, by that point, England was not using any slaves itself, any slave labor itself. And actually, as the South saw that it was losing the Civil War, it was hoping England would come in on its side because it was a big trade partner with England. One reason England didn't do that was because it didn't want to partner with the South because it used slave labor, and it didn't want to be formally associated with that, even though it was informally associated through trade and trade policies, etc. So Locke and Jefferson are two people again, and many other examples of this, not just these two people, who philosophically, politically understood that slavery was wrong, that slavery was an evil, but weren't willing themselves to assert themselves too much in trying to end it and end the practice of slavery. Again, as I already mentioned, Locke died in 1704. He had maybe a little bit of a short lifespan for people of his day, at least the people that lived beyond childhood or youth, and many people didn't live beyond childhood and youth, but those did live, most of them a little longer than Locke, but not a great deal longer. Let me say something more briefly about this issue of governance. So we have the traditional monarchy that I talked about and various kinds of autocrats, right? Typically kings and queens. You have the Tsar in Russia. You had autocrats also in China and Japan. You had the shogun tradition, etc. They were autocrats because they basically controlled and had power over everything, even over the practice of religion as it existed at the time. You then move along to what were called constitutional monarchies. So the monarchy still had power, but the monarchy had to function according to a constitution that at least some people had a voice in creating. So the monarchy was not absolute in power anymore. So that's sort of a step, right, towards democracy. And then you end up with parliamentary democracy ultimately. And I think Locke saw that as a natural kind of progression of societies away from autocracy to constitutional monarchy and then to parliamentary democracy. And there's some other intermediate steps along the way there. But these are basically in their infancy at this time. And we'll talk about this development over the course of the semester with other people that we will read. And we'll see the different stages, the different countries we're in at different times in terms of ultimately getting to something like democracy, at least for many of the nations that we'll talk about. And we'll also look at the practice of slavery too, and how that changed over time. As some of you might know, in Russia, there was they had slaves that they called serfs, a little bit of a different practice and use of serfs than we had slaves over here, but similar. They emancipated the serfs also in the middle of the 19th century, however, earlier than the slaves were emancipated in this country. But we'll talk about that a little later. Let me talk about the idea of religious toleration, because that was really important here. and many people saw that it was necessary for countries to advance politically this idea that they really needed to allow people to choose their own religion. And Locke had an argument about that. And he begins the second treatise in government sort of talking about the fact that it's impossible to trace the authority of an autocrat all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? And belief somehow that these autocrats and descendants from Adam and Eve ultimately were ruling by divine right, right? And that they had all the earth as their dominion, as supposedly Adam and Eve did early on, et cetera. So he basically does away with that idea and eventually moves towards representative government. But his letters concerning toleration were written between 1689 and 1692 in the aftermath of the European wars of religion, formulated a classical reasoning for religious tolerance. And there were three parts to this argument. The first were that the earthly judges, meaning human beings, moral human beings, in particular the state and the government as it's run by ordinary human beings, and human beings generally, cannot dependently evaluate the truth claims of competing religious standpoints. Right? Different religions have their truth claims, their foundation beliefs, and many of them are based in faith. Faith is a different foundation for belief than empirical science is. It's still that way today, right? If you compare people who follow evolution versus creationism, right? It's sort of apples and oranges because a lot of creationism is sort of ultimately based in faith and belief through faith rather than belief through empirical science. So Locke said basically earthly judges and even in the state in particular as agents of government can't really evaluate between truth claims at different religious standpoints. So that's number one. Number two, even if they could, enforcing a single religion would not have the desired effort because belief cannot be compelled by violence. Right? People are going to believe what they're going to believe, even if you have a state religion or try to outlaw religion altogether. People are on their own going to practice religion. They're going to practice their faith in the basements of their homes or wherever they can hide away from the representatives of the police or other groups that might be trying to keep them from practicing their religion and make sure they practice the state religion or whatever it might be. And this is what happened, right? You see this in lots of different countries where people are fighting for religious toleration, that they basically have to practice the religion on the sly, right? That's why the Puritans came to North America and other groups for the free practice of their religion that they didn't have in Europe. Then number three, coercing religious uniformity would lead to more social disorder than allowing diversity. In other words, trying to get people to practice the same religion is going to cause more social disorder, revolutions, wars, etc., than just allowing people to practice their own religion. Now, that ultimately is going to be limited in a certain way through the social contract theory that we'll talk about, right? You cannot, for example, practice a religion in this country that calls for human sacrifice, right? It's some place you have to draw a line, right? And we'll talk about sort of how that works. But however, you can practice many different religions in this country. Even Satanism, you can freely practice in this country, right? This is Locke's argument for religious toleration. He didn't develop it just on his own. Other people, again, were pushing for this. Montesquieu, most famously, perhaps. But that was an influence on Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers, as they are called, in this country, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They did follow the same basic argument for religious toleration that, again, was very important. I want to talk a little bit about Locke in relationship to some other thinkers that we are working with. And unfortunately, I don't think I can get the rest of my slides to work. Maybe I can here. Let me see if I can finagle things and show you my other slides. I wanted to share with you a slide that shows the relationship between Locke and Jefferson, since that's so important. So I'll see if I can get that to work here with a little finagling. So we have Locke and Jefferson. Locke's second treatise of government clearly influenced Thomas Jefferson as he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And not only Jefferson, but other of these what were called classical liberal thinkers. Classical liberal thinking is basically the philosophy and political philosophy that replace the authority of tradition and the church. And all sort of modern political philosophy that emphasizes individual human rights grows out of classical liberalism. Both political parties in this country, the two major ones, I should say, right, Republicans and Democrats, are classical liberals. Now, they have different ways of talking about individual rights and freedoms and how we should secure those, what kinds of limitations we can or should have on individual rights and freedoms, how far those rights and freedoms extend, et cetera. But they also ultimately do embrace classical liberal philosophy. So you can see we have Locke on the left in the treatise. The state of nature has a law to govern it. And we saw that Locke talked quite a bit about human beings in the state of nature. And Jefferson also wrote about the laws of nature and nature's God. Now, Jefferson was not talking about a particular religion. Locke, like most of the other founders, were deists. They believe in some kind of a God, but they didn't practice a particular religion. I think in part because they didn't think they were really in the position to choose between a lot of the different religions, which one is correct, which is incorrect, which God is the true God. So their thinking was kind of more general than that. You will see a brief reference to God in the Declaration of Independence, because obviously those deist beliefs did influence their thinking. You won't find that in the Constitution, however, reference to God. So they did believe in this. There was these laws of nature, and those were basically life, liberty, and property, as you see in the second treatise on the left. Locke called that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he adjusted it a little bit. There are a couple reasons for it. One reason, probably the main reason, is because Jefferson also read Aristotle. Aristotle claimed that happiness was the ultimate goal of all human life. All human beings ultimately do things for happiness. They may educate themselves. They may develop careers and jobs. They may have families, do all kinds of things. But ultimately, if you look at what they're trying to achieve, is happiness. And Jefferson claimed that property was only a means to that happiness, but he wanted to have the ultimate goal of human life sort of in the Declaration. So he put life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness versus life, liberty, and property. A secondary reason, perhaps, was because property for Locke included the human body and control of your body. And Locke said that nobody can take that control away from you. You can maybe give it up voluntarily if you want to, give control of your body and of your labor to somebody else through getting a job and being an employee, right? Where you have to do certain kinds of work to get paid for it. But nobody can forcefully take control of your labor and your body from you. You can't actually even give somebody the right to take your life from you, because that's given to you by the divine, by God, ultimately. You can see that basically means that the kind of slavery that was practiced in this country would be against nature, or once civil society, once human beings form a government, And that's the next step, right? You start in the state of nature, and then you form a government, and that's when you call the state of civil society, right, or of the political state, etc. You can see there basically that Locke is saying that slavery is against nature, right? And he even calls it a form of war. When somebody tries to use your body, use your labor without your authority, basically you're in a state of war with that person. And so slavery for him was a state of war. The only kind of slavery that Locke acknowledges as something that might be practiced, and this goes all the way back again to ancient Greece at least, people that make war against you, people that attack you, try and take your land from you, and your possessions from you, etc. If you defeat them in war, you can sort of enslave them. And that was a form of slavery that was practiced, as I said, for hundreds and hundreds of years, that Locke still saw some kind of legitimation in. Now, typically the idea was it was just the generation that made war against you and not the children. So whereas you might enslave sort of temporarily the people that again try to take your land and property, because their children didn't do that, their children would be free, even though you could enslave them. So he did acknowledge that form of slavery, but he did not see as legitimate, and again saw as a state of war between people, the kind of enforced slavery in this country where people were taken from their homelands, brought to this country against their will, in chains, and forced to do others' bidding, where other people controlled their bodies and every aspect of their lives. We know that Jefferson, for example, had children with at least one of his slaves. That was very common because you had the rights to the body of your slaves. There's no way they could try and take that power and authority from you. They couldn't go to the law and say, that my master raped me, because the master would say, hey, he owns your body. There's nothing you can do about that, right? That was a form of slavery that Locke, philosophically at least, was against. Now, again, he was implicated in the slavery that was practiced in the Carolinas because he was involved with these treaties and these trade companies. Next, men being by nature all free, equal, and independent, right, is the same idea as all men are created equal, right? A much debated idea today. That the initial change that was made to that was by women in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Declaration, where Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton changed that in their own version of the Declaration of Independence to all men and women are created equal, through what was called the Seneca Falls Declaration in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. They based their own Declaration of Rights for women on the Declaration of Independence, and they changed it to all men and women are created equal. One reason that they use the Declaration of Independence as their model is because the Declaration of Independence, as well as John Locke's second treatise of government, said you not only have a right, but a duty to revolt if your rights of life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are being taken away from you, if the government is not protecting those. And women were saying, hey, if you follow the classical liberal philosophy and apply it to all people as it should be, and not just men, it should say all men and women are created equal. We are revolting against the government because we're not given these rights. So famously, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's colleague, Susan B. Anthony, who was single, would try to vote, and she did any number of times and was arrested. She was single, didn't have a family, so she could afford to be thrown in jail, at least temporarily, for trying to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton ultimately wanted to be a housewife, but it was her choice, and she was a great writer. She wrote speeches that Susan B. Anthony would deliver, but she had a big family. She couldn't afford to be arrested, whereas Susan B. Anthony could. So both of them embrace that. And then again, that all men were created equal. The way in which people defined males other than white Europeans viewed them as less than fully human. And we'll talk about over the course of the semester. Most famously, that was obviously done to Africans, and African Americans were viewed as less than fully human because they didn't have an equal endowment mentally. The same argument was made against people from China and Asia who were viewed as not fully human, and is a reason for limiting immigration to this country. We actually had something called the Chinese Exclusion Act that excluded Chinese people from this country. Same thing was true of Native Americans, although they were viewed as being intellectually, by a lot of people, at least by Jefferson, as being viewed as intellectually equal to white Europeans, that their culture was not equal to white European culture. So they should assimilate to white European culture or get out of the way, right? And allow these European Americans to take over all of North America. So the last thing you see on here is consent, by the government. The government should only take certain acts based on the consent of the people. And you can see, so we have the kind of Locke statement of that idea, and then we have Jefferson's statement of that idea. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And any other power that they try to exercise is not just. And people have not just a right, but a duty to revolt against it if their government is trying to take power that it should not, that is not, legitimately have the authority for. So there, as you can see, how some of the influence takes place here. Slavery and property, I sort of already talked a little bit about, right? That the property means your own body and the right to control your own body. Locke also talked a lot about property in terms of land, and ultimately argued that the reason that governments exist, and their only legitimate reason to exist at the most basic level, is to help you protect your property. It all goes back to that for Locke, property. And you can see in Western cultures, and certainly in this country, where owning property is viewed as it's almost, it's part of the American dream. It's almost got a pseudo spiritual sort of significance to have your own property, because things like the right to vote often go with owning property. You can do whatever you want on your property within certain kinds of limits, right? So it's a super significant thing. And certainly it was for the founders in this country. There are different ways in which you can acquire property, but essentially it's to apply your labor to that property. Now, there's different kinds of property, right, that Locke talks about. If you have, which existed at the time in North America in Jefferson's day, lots of land that nobody owned. Let's say there was an apple tree growing somewhere that was on property that somebody didn't own. You could go and pick those apples, and if you put your labor into them, then they become yours. They also become more valuable. You can sort of charge money for them, right? Because you spent the time, you put the labor into actually picking those apples. The same thing is true if you went and chopped down a tree and made a chair out of it. You put your labor into that process, you turn those raw materials, the tree, into something that was more valuable, that chair, right? And you could charge money for it. And what you're doing is you're adding value to it. And so that's basically where Locke's theory of value comes from, taking raw materials, adding your labor to them to make them more valuable. So that's one way in which things acquire value, so that you can charge money for them. And you would seemingly pay less for just some boards of wood from a tree than you would from a chair, right? Because somebody put all the time and labor and their specific skills into making that chair. The same thing would be true ultimately if you can cultivate land and put your labor into that land and get a crop out of it. That land could become yours if it already wasn't owned by somebody else. And even though you could not eat potentially not eat all the food that you cultivated, you could sell it in the market and somebody else could use it before it's spoiled, right? And so you would still be adding value to that land. What existed at the time, mostly in Jefferson's day, were called yeoman farmers. Y-E-O-M-A-N is how that's spelled. Basically, single-family farms. You grow crops for your family and your extended family, and maybe whatever the surplus was, you would sell in the market. But it was not a big cash crop farm as we tend to think of them as they developed eventually. And in fact, the ideal citizen for Jefferson, the ideal democratic citizen, was a single-family farmer because of the kinds of attitudes, habits you develop as a single-family farmer. You work hard, you labor hard, you learn to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? You become self-reliant, you acquire all these practical skills. So the ideal citizen for Jefferson was a single-family farmer. During the end of Jefferson's life, you could actually see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And he was really concerned that it would ruin the American way of life, that working in factories and getting away from the way of life of the farmer was going to somehow destroy democracy. So again, it's interesting to think about what Jefferson would think about his ideas, his beliefs, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the world we live in today. There are many people who are called literalists, right? More conservative typically, that like to look in particular at the Constitution and try to interpret it the way they thought the founders interpreted it. Other people will argue that the founders, yeah, they were hoping to write something that would be a universal document that would withstand the test of time, but that many of them, if you read their other writings, would have also recognized that things change over time. And maybe the Constitution would have to be interpreted differently, even the basic elements of the Constitution, right? That things would have to be changed and added to it in terms of the Bill of Rights, right? And different articles that we add to the Constitution. And it would be interpreted a little bit differently. Typically, people who are not, real literalists will believe that, we can't just interpret the Constitution the way the founders did. Most famously, you see that when you look at, the right to free speech is one thing, the right to own arms, right? That you see debated so heavily today, right? The founders were thinking of people owning a couple guns to keep somebody from robbing them, to keep the government from taking their rights away from them. You see this still in militia groups today who are concerned about government, to kill animals and feed themselves, or animals that are trying to cause harm to them, to have a militia if another country or peoples invades them, that they have a militia they can put together. But they certainly did not foresee the kind of weaponry that we have today, which is why people who want to put some limitations on gun ownership say, look, we should limit these kinds of guns that you only use in warfare, that are essentially weapons of mass destruction, where you can just shoot down hordes of people in a few seconds. That's not what the founders had in mind when they talked about the right to bear arms, right? So again, a lot of these things are interestingly debated. But this right to own property is very important, obviously, for Locke, and very important in this country. So that, again, you can acquire property if you put your labor into it. Now, you probably saw that Locke wanted to put a limitation on property when he believed that people were owning something that was just going to waste. You don't that it had to be something that was being really used practically, right? It went against nature to go and pull 100 apples off a tree if you're only going to use 10 of them, unless the rest of them rot. Right. So that was something that Locke argued, kind of went against nature, and that you shouldn't really have a right to do. If you collected those apples and sold 80 of them, and kept 20 for yourself, that was okay. But Locke was initially, he's going back and imagining a time before money existed and durable goods existed, when he's talking about things rotting and going bad, right? Once you do have durable goods, you can amass wealth in terms of durable goods where things are not going to go bad. And Locke had nothing against the idea of amassing wealth in terms of durable goods or in terms of money once money is invented. He did want money to be based on gold and silver because he argued that it's valuable everywhere, versus paper money, which is created by the government and is only valuable in the country of where that government exists. So he did want currency. If you did have currency, wanted to be based on the gold and silver, but ultimately wanted gold and silver to be those forms of currency that were used. But he realizes that, as societies would develop over time, they would have durable goods, they would have a currency and gold and silver that people would trade with, and you could buy things again with barter things with those durable goods or buy things with money. The other thing in terms of the value of property that Locke talked about was supply and demand, right? That things had value because people put labor into them, number one. So you could charge more for a chair than just for a pile of wood. The other thing he argued was supply and demand. So the smaller the supply was of something, the more valuable it was. Similarly, the greater demand there was for something, the more valuable it was. And the reverse also applies, right? The greater supply there is, the less valuable something is. The less demand there is, the less valuable there is. Supply and demand still functions today. When we think about laissez-faire economics, right, traditional economic theory, that's what it's based on. It's based on supply and demand. And we'll talk about that and with other of our theorists we'll discuss over the course of the semester. So we'll come back to supply and demand and talk about it quite a bit. So those are the two kinds of value theory that Locke was working with: supply and demand, and a labor theory of property. Locke also believed, following people like Adam Smith in his famous book, Wealth of Nations, that there wasn't a limited supply of wealth that any nation or any individual could have. First of all, he believed that the amount of land that existed, at least his day and age, it seemed like there's enough land for everybody and enough raw materials and resources for everybody. We know that that's not the case. And we know that certain kinds of amassing and acquiring wealth and land are not economically or ecologically, sustainable, right? That's where the movement today, environmentalism movement, comes from. Locke couldn't even imagine that in his day. And in fact, that was a reason for believing that Native Americans' culture was inferior because they didn't use the natural resources of the land the way Europeans did. They didn't use up the land, right? They believed in the fact that they were part of the land, that it was a part of them, that sustainability, they would move around so they wouldn't use up the land, especially the hunter-gatherers, right? Now, the Europeans tried to get them to settle down and become farmers because there they would use less land, and that left more land for the Europeans. And then we get reservations and other things coming along. But the inferiority of the culture of Native Americans oftentimes was based in this idea that they're savage because God in the Bible gave Adam and Eve nature to subdue and control and use, and to view themselves as superior to nature, right? So there's this hierarchy there where human beings exist over and against nature and above it, are superior to it. It's there to serve them. That's not the way Native Americans tended to view nature, right? They viewed themselves as a part of nature, as it a part of them. You know, after you killed an animal to eat, you would say a prayer thanking nature and God or gods, since most of them were pantheistic, for, you know, providing this food for you. You might have noticed several times in what we read for first reading from Locke's second treatise, these backhanded criticisms of these other peoples who did not use the land appropriately. He's thinking of Native Americans at that point. And his idea basically became policy for Native Americans, right? Either they agree to assimilate to European American culture and use the land the way Europeans did, either becoming artisans or becoming farmers, having a particular piece of land that was theirs, or they needed to move out and keep moving west. We would put them on reservations as that reservation land seemed to be more valuable for gold or mining, you know, for other things during the gold rush. We pushed them farther and farther to the west on these reservations to the land that really didn't have any value. And it was hard for them to live on the land in the reservations. That's why so many of them historically have struggled. It was the worst land. If it was really good agricultural land that we told them we wanted to settle down and farm on, Europeans would have kept it for themselves, or they would have taken it as they did from Native Americans. People have argued that that Locke kind of gave a justification for the manifest destiny idea of European Americans to take over all of North America, to subdue all of it, that it was built into his ideas about property and his ideas about labor and the right to take land from Native Americans who weren't using that land properly the way nature dictates, that they use the land for its natural resources, right? That they cut down the trees and they plant farms, and that they dig up raw materials to make things out of, iron and gold and the things that artisans, you know, would do. If you're a blacksmith or a goldsmith or a cooper making barrels or whatever it might be. And I think there's something to that idea that he seemed to justify that. He did think that, he did at least theorize what would happen if a few people acquired too much wealth. But he didn't talk about he didn't have a solution to that. He didn't get into that. Clearly, that's one of the things we've struggled with in capitalist countries and in this country. What happens when it looks like there's a 99% of people that own the vast majority of the wealth, and the 1%, you know, excuse me, the 1% owns the vast majority, and the 99% own the minority. What kind of power imbalance does that create? How can you have a democracy when you have that kind of power imbalance? And we know that wealth does play a role, and who is elected to political office and who's making decisions about policy on land and wealth and economics and those kinds of things. So Locke foresaw that might be a problem, but he really, you know, didn't get into it too much. So you'll see Locke talking about the role of government and the consent of the governed. And so you can see here this idea of the consent of the governed, a social contract, which we'll get into in a minute, the right to revolution that was really important, and property, most important of those natural rights. That's the reason we form governments. There can be other legitimations for why we form governments that lead to different forms of governments. Plato believed we form governments, interestingly, because we can have our basic needs met better if we share labor, and that we need governments to, again, protect us. And so there was some overlap with Locke, but he emphasized a lot more this idea of not being self-sufficient, but that was more efficient to specialize in a certain kind of job. Other people would specialize in a different job, and, you know, would sell or share their, you know, their goods with you, you know, et cetera. And the government played a role in terms of how justice was dispensed, et cetera. But he didn't emphasize property quite the way that Locke emphasized property as the most basic legitimation for having governments. So the state of nature and civil society becomes really important here. in terms of how and why we have governments. So let me talk about that a little bit here. Again, just give me a second. I need to do all this manually. So again, the reason we have governments is to protect our property, essentially. So in the state of nature, you can basically, if you have land that people don't own, you can go live on that land. You can take the natural resources of that land, and other people can do the same thing. However, there are limits to living in the state of nature. Some have to do with your view of human nature. Notice how Locke believed that human beings are basically rational creatures, so that they can form their own governments and make decisions about how everybody's going to live, etc., using their rational faculties. There are other people who viewed human beings as basically what Thomas Hobbes called, they said human life is nasty, brutish, and short, and viewed human nature as really aggressive. People ultimately want power and control and will take other people's lives because they want their stuff and they want their land, etc. So Hobbes theorized a very totalitarian form of government, where he said everybody should be willing to give up power to a very strong central government to protect them. Now, Locke had a somewhat similar idea that you would give up some of your rights, but you would have not this really top-down authoritarian form of government. You would have a democracy, because he believed humans were rational enough by nature as humans, creatures, that they could create their own governments, where the people who ran the governments were citizens. You could vote them into office for a certain amount of time. They would serve the needs of their constituency, right? And so you end up with a much more of a positive view of human nature that you see in Locke than you see in somebody like Thomas Hobbes and his what he called the Leviathan, which was his idea of a form of government that you would have for a peoples that he viewed as really aggressive and warlike in terms of how they treated each other. I can't, the situation now with my computer, I can't pull up my Hobbes versus Locke slide that I have, but you can just do a search for Hobbes versus Locke, and you can see how Hobbes' view of human nature was much more negative than Locke's view was. Therefore, the form of government that Locke talks about is much more democratic, much more based on human participation of citizens, etc., of trusting people to make decisions for you. And that's how we move from the state of nature to what he called civil society. Civil society is what you create when you form a government. The reason you do that is because even though Locke viewed human beings, basically by nature as rational, that there would be conflicts. You would have people sometimes who would do violence against somebody else or steal their things, just because human beings aren't perfect, even though they're basically rational. And in the state of nature, the only authority that you have if somebody attacks you or takes your stuff is your own power to defend yourself, and maybe if they're trying to kill you, to kill them, or if they steal your stuff, to go steal their stuff, right? And there's nothing that regulates that. So Locke said one of the reasons people go into civil society and form governments is to have what he called sort of an earthly authority, because otherwise you don't have one. And people are going to be biased. If you have somebody who you don't like and they steal from you, you're likely to be much more aggressive back at them than if they're people who you don't already have, a real negative view of. So you can't make sure that the way in which people deal with injustice, violence, and stealing is going to be fair. And there are two things that Locke really looks at there when we do form civil society and create laws, because he was concerned that laws are such that they deter people from committing crimes. That's one justification for laws. A second justification is a kind of reparations, that if somebody does you harm, that they owe you something back for that in the form of money. Today, that's big, right? If somebody causes you physical injury and sues you, or some kind of other reparations. In a very simple agrarian form of society, if they took two of your cows, you got to take two of their cows. That would be called reparations, right? Well, reparations, when you don't have a government, when you don't have a justice system, you can't be sure that's going to be that people are going to actually do that fairly and objectively. So human beings should be willing to give up their absolute freedom in the state of nature to have a more limited kind of freedom in civil society. And that's what we call social contract theory. And so I am going to make sure to share that slide with you here. This one actually has Hobbes versus Locke on social contract theory. So this one actually will be a good one for me to share here. So you see, they both had a kind of social contract theory, but because they viewed human nature as different, they had different forms of social contract theory. The basic idea is that you will give up absolute rights that you would have in the state of nature and have some limitations on your rights and freedoms to have the security of government and laws, a justice system, a police force, right? Other kinds of things, laws that are going to help protect you. And the people will be willing to do that, to give up absolute freedom, to have some limits on their freedom. Now, again, if you view our two major political parties in this country, you can see that's a sticking point, right? How many and what kind of freedoms are you willing to give up for the greater good, or because you supposedly will benefit from them? Think about social programs, right? Those are big ones because typically they're taking some of your salary from you, but the idea is that society benefits from them and that we all benefit from paying taxes to build roads and to other kinds of things. But people want to know that they do benefit from their tax dollars with a military and a police force and roads and other kinds of things, right? Things that they can't directly see how they benefit from. Many people, especially people who are more conservative, are more concerned about paying taxes, right, towards those things. In this country, education historically has been viewed as something that everybody benefits from. So even if you don't have kids you send to the local school, you have to pay taxes to the local school because the belief is you benefit from young people in your community having a formal education, right? But you pay pretty large school taxes. Even if you don't have a kid going to school, maybe you didn't have any kids, or your kids have already graduated, or they're too young to go to school, you still pay those, school taxes. Some people are willing to pay higher taxes for things in the military, et cetera. That's why voting on budgets is so controversial. Budgets at the state level, budgets at the federal level, right? Right now, the government's trying to hash out a plan for COVID relief. People who are more liberal are more willing to have our tax dollars go to a larger COVID plan. It's $1.9 billion currently. And I'm speaking obviously in 2021, than conservatives are, that don't want so much of that tax money going to those larger programs that they don't think all people will necessarily benefit from. So there are all different ways in which social contract theory operates. But you can see the different views of human nature here, right? For Hobbes, people are naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish. For Locke, humans are naturally reasonable, moral, and good. So for Hobbes, to escape the brutish life that people have with the, cruel, greedy, and selfish people around them. They're willing to enter a social contract. For Locke, humans have natural rights like liberty and property, and they form governments to protect those natural rights. Right? But for Locke, because there's a more positive view of human nature, you don't give up nearly as many rights as you would give up in Hobbes, what he calls the Leviathan, on his very top-down sort of totalitarian society that he actually believed would be something like an absolute monarchy or have some kind of absolute power that the government has in some way or another. So only a powerful government could ensure an orderly society with Hobbes. For Locke, because human beings are basically reasonable, they can have representative government with limited power. Though again, that's the sticking point, is how much power will the government have? Lots of debates, and all different people that consider themselves classical liberals and Democrats all have different views about how much power the government should have. We'll talk about that when we read the Anti-Federalist and Federalist papers that were written around the time in which the Constitution was written. If governments violate the people's rights, they have the right to overthrow the government. It's actually stronger than that. They have a duty to overthrow the government. That's actually not totally correct if their rights are taken away from them. Now, you don't actually sign a social contract when you are born. It's sort of imagined, right? Basically, how that works in this country, for example, first of all, to live in a society that has social contract theory that operates according to it, you have to have the right to leave. If you don't have the right to leave, there's no sense in imagining you're signing a contract that says, I agree to live by the laws of the society, because you have no choice, right? In Soviet Russia, you didn't have a choice to leave. You had to stay there. And other kind of totalitarian governments, that's still the case. And totalitarian governments today, right? You'd have the right to leave, or only a limited right to leave in some countries, right? Because you are not living in a country where you're voluntarily giving up just some of your rights to have the protection of government. But with social contract theory, you have to have the right to leave. You can see something like social contract theory going all the way back to Plato's day. He seems to make an argument for social contract theory through Socrates in one of his dialogues, when he talks about the fact that Socrates was put in jail for supposedly breaking the laws in Athens, and he had a right to leave Athens. He didn't. He decided to live there. So when he breaks the laws, he can't say, that the laws were unfair, because he could either have gotten involved in the government and worked to change those laws and recognize that he only had a certain amount of political power, or he could have left and lived somewhere else, but he didn't, right? So you don't actually sign a contract. So in this country, once you become 18, you become an adult. You can go and live wherever you want. If you decide that you don't want to live in this country because you don't like the form of government we have or policies, you can go live somewhere else. Or you can get involved in politics, and you have the right to vote so that you can indirectly change the way the society runs, right? That's social contract theory. So it's an imagined contract that you are signing, essentially, in this country when you turn 18, if you agree to live in this country. So real important, obviously, idea here that we see with Locke. I just have a couple more things to talk about here. One is the self and personal identity. This is really interesting. Locke was one of the first philosophers, empiricist philosophers, to really start thinking about these broader questions. Where does our sense of self come from? Where does our sense of identity come from? And he argued that it comes from what he called a psychological continuity. So as it says here, Locke argued that real identity is found in psychological continuity, not in the physical continuity of the body. Basically, it comes from our consciousness and our memory. So the second bullet point here, personal identity for Locke is a matter of the continuity of consciousness from one moment to another, right? We have the memory of being the same person right now than we were 10 minutes ago, an hour ago, 3 days ago, 4 months ago, 8 years ago, etc. Right now, our memory gets harder, and our sense of who we were is harder to kind of conjure up the longer we go back in the past because our memories become weaker. This is the reason that people often decide to write autobiographies. Not just to tell other people who they were, but to try and piece together their life and say, how did I get to where I am now? Often they have a personal psychological reason for writing autobiographies, right? Especially people who have had traumatic memory losses or other kinds of things, or end up in a place where maybe they don't like where they ended up. Where did I go wrong? Right? Well, we'll do an autobiography, even if you don't formally write an autobiography, you'll kind of try and think back into the past and figure out how you got to where you are now. And basically, we do that through chains of memory. So our basic sense of self and identity comes from consciousness and memory for Locke. Now, it does say here that not from our physical continuity of the body, right? Our bodies change over time radically, right? Especially from 1 year to the next, 10 years, 20 years, we look very different, right? Those of you who go to your high school reunions in 20 years, even in 10 years, sometimes you won't notice people that were even in your class in high school because they look so differently. It's not totally true, however, to say that Locke dispensed altogether with this idea of physical continuity. Though he said psychological continuity was the major part of our identity, he did say that physical continuity is still something that's important to us. When you look in the mirror every day, if you looked totally different, it would freak you out, right? You recognize you change over time, right? And that your body changes. But I would say that your physical continuity, as you remember it from one day, month, year to the next, is also somewhat of a part of your sense of your continuity. And it's why people kind of get upset and notice when their bodies age and change over the time, when they do look different over time. They feel like a different person, right? Because what they can do changes, and the way other people view them, the way they view themselves. So there is an element of physical continuity there. So this is another one of those slides where the person wasn't totally accurate. But the main part of it is psychological continuity, our sense of self and identity. So as such, identity is not a matter of the physical substance of the person, but rather of consciousness. The mind of a person is the thing that really underpins who they are for Locke. It's this mind that makes the different connections between the different and varied experiences that we have. Just briefly, there's a famous thought experiment about physical continuity called the Ship of the Theseus. It's based on the story of a ship that was over time. It was a very old ship over time, as some planks that were used from the boat were replaced gradually. The argument is, at what point when you replace planks does it actually become a different ship? When you replaced exactly 51% of the planks, does it become a new ship? What if you replace all of the planks? Does it become a completely different ship? Right? And it gets us thinking a little bit about physical continuity over time, and using the kind of physical criterion for continuity over time, and thinking about this ship. Does it stay the same ship over time, even though all the planks are become different? Is it when 98% of the planks are still the same, or 50%? Right? That's where things, are. You can't come to a cut and dried kind of place at which you would say necessarily that things become different. And you'll see this. The same thing will happen with you as happened with me in my 50s, where your body starts to look very differently, and you sometimes start to feel like a different person, because your memories of the past become harder to conjure up, and because you look differently as well. So that was another thing Locke was very interested in, was this personal identity, ideas about the self, and how we change over time. And just another thing on Locke's empiricism, I'll put up real briefly here, because I want to talk about education for Locke, and then we'll be done for this lecture. Glad I got most of these to work. So how do we get ideas? I talked about empiricism. British empiricists, they come through experiences, they come through our senses, etc. And the way Locke explained this in a book of his called On Human Understanding is, as you can see here, we get simple ideas through the senses. Each perception gives us the raw material of experience. He called these sense data. We collect sense data through our different senses. It's like we're always being sort of bombarded with all these different sense data. We do not choose to receive these ideas. We simply receive them passively as we experience the world. That's an important idea. People still believe that obviously our senses take in information about the world, but they believe we do that actively, even if not consciously, versus Locke, who believed we did it passively. Simple ideas come through these sense data, and the way our senses and our body works, those are automatically pieced together to make simple ideas. So you don't have to work and go through a process of thought to create simple ideas out of sense data. Our body does that for us automatically, which was why there are things that we agree on. And examples here, whiteness, hardness, sweetness, right? We all experience those things pretty much the same because our bodies, when they take in the same sense data, they form the same simple ideas. And those are things that we all sort of share. Complex ideas are different. They're formed from connecting simple ideas to make complex ideas. Those are things, even though they have birch tree, unicorn here as examples, those tend to be things that we don't necessarily agree on. They involve interpretation, right? We might, let's use the example of birds here, what a bird looks like. Might be a better example. If you live in different parts of the country and parts of the world, your idea of what a bird is going to be slightly different because the kind of birds you have and exist in your area are going to be somewhat different. So your idea of birdness as a complex idea might be somewhat different. That's a better example here. All of our ideas come from these processes. Thus, if we have an idea of God or the external world, we'll have to be able to describe it by these processes. So basically, the idea is for DS that God gave us these senses to learn about the world, etc. There are different metaphors that are used here. One is, first of all, there are no innate ideas, as there are for some philosophers. Plato's most famous for arguing that learning is actually remembering. He believed in reincarnation, and that as our soul was coming back to embody a new body and a new life, we drink from the river of forgetfulness, and we would forget so many things we learned from our previous life, and we would have to remember them, in a new existence, in a new life. Because that was the only way he could explain where ideas come from. Because you have to start, you can't make sense of reality without starting with something. Locke said, actually, no, we're a blank slate in terms of ideas when we're born. However, he explained where we start having ideas from, because he said that the analogy we would use today for it is to say that the brain is like a calculator. It has the ability to perform certain functions when we input data and sense data, through our sight and hearing, etc. Or if you think of a calculator, right, you input numbers, and but the calculator, when you hit the right buttons, can automatically get the square root, multiply, divide, etc. So that's how Locke kind of described how you can start from ground zero when you come into the world and develop ideas, right? You have to start somewhere. Basically, it's because we have this kind of internal, what we would say today is kind of like a computer that we're born with. But he still believed in this blank slate or tabula rasa idea. Sometimes he talked about a cabinet that our sense data and our experiences are stored in. These are, however, still passive ideas for how we learn. Experience happens to us. It's not something where we reach out into the world and actively engage in. That's different than most learning theories today, who focus more on what's called constructivism, where we construct meanings and ideas. Those of you who are education students will learn about this, or have already learned about this, that through our habits and our minds and our experiences, that we are constantly actively influencing the environment, actively interpreting it, interacting with it in a way that that our ideas, that our experiences are actually not just passively acquired, but acquired through various kinds of human action. Locke also believed, because we depend on experiences, right? He's an empiricist for our learning, that that's a real important part of our education, is to learn how to hone your senses. Because if you have the wrong idea, the wrong idea about things in your environment, you'll create bad ideas, false ideas. So early educators who were influenced by Locke, and there are a number of them, Fribble, who invented the idea of the kindergarten, a guy named Pestalozzi, who started Swiss schools, really all emphasized how it's important from an early age to learn how to use your senses and to learn how to use them effectively, to develop acuity with your senses. Pestalozzi talked about what he called object lessons, where you would take something apart, put it back together, you would feel it, touch it, see it, smell it, right, to develop your senses. So these early empiricists all really talked a lot about the importance of developing your senses educationally from an early age, because if your senses didn't develop in a real acute way, you'd have false ideas about the world, particularly those complex ideas that you would form. So I know that was a rather lengthy lecture. A lot of my lectures won't be this long, but Locke's a really important, formative person for us for this semester. So I wanted to make sure I touched on things. And I did touch on a bunch of things, as you know from the lecture, that I gave you a background in, because we'll talk about them more with the people that will read over the semester. So again, that's the reason this particular lecture was going to be longer than most. So I hope you found that useful. At any point, again, if you have any questions, please email me and let me know. I'm happy to help you over email, or if you want to set up a Zoom meeting with me, just let me know. Remember to follow the syllabus in terms of what to read when assignments are due, when you see things bolded that tell you assignments are due. Those would be papers or discussion questions. You will find those assignments will be posted in Canvas for you. So I'll see you again with my next lecture.